Hey folks, before we get started, I just wanted to tell you, you can unlock unlimited access to political news, commentary, opinion, and a whole lot more at inforum.news/port for only 99 cents a month for your first 3 months. Hurry, get this limited time offer at inforum.news/port now. This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Hello, folks, and welcome to your Wednesday edition of Plain Talk. Happy to be with you. Normally on Wednesdays, I'm joined by Chad Oban, but Chad is in Arizona not watching baseball. He was supposed to go for spring training, and I guess the league had other ideas. They're having a fight. Everybody's fighting these days. The players and the owners are fighting, so they're not playing baseball, and he's in Arizona doing I don't know what. He was texting me last night. I don't know what he's up to, but definitely not watching baseball. Joining me, though, for today's conversation is Matt Von Pinnon. He is the editor of the Fargo Forum. Matt, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Rob. How are you doing?
I am doing good. It's always good business to live in interesting political times, and it seems like the political times are always interesting. You know, at the dawn of every election cycle, I say to myself, it kind of looks like it's going to be a boring year. Like, none of these races are very competitive. And then something happens, and it turns out to be not all that boring. So this is one of those years. And, you know, I think obviously what's been on the top of my radar, which I've been talking about, is what's happening in the North Dakota Republican Party. I don't want to say that our Democratic friends are irrelevant, because they're not. They're important. In fact, I interviewed their U.S. Senate candidate just last week. I mean, that stuff matters, but I mean, as a practical matter, you know, what happens in the Republican Party is what's going to happen on the November ballot. And, you know, we have John Hoeven, of all people, arguably one of the most successful politicians North Dakota's ever seen, is you know, kind of fighting for his life and maybe that's overstating it, but I mean, we don't know what's going to happen at this state convention in a couple of weeks. And that's unusual. I mean, usually you take Hoeven to the bank when he's on the ballot. But what has your view been of this? Because it's a very unusual situation.
Yeah, well, I totally agree with you, Rob, that, you know, if you had asked me 3-4 months ago what kind of a political cycle this was going to be, I would have yawned probably. Yeah. And maybe said, you know, keep your eye on the Attorney General's race. Maybe something strange happens there. You know, keep an eye on some of the local legislative districts because of redistricting, you know, what'll happen there. But really, and maybe just a little bit of intrigue around the Secretary of State's race, which, you know, for most people just doesn't get much attention, but certainly kind of a wide open field there maybe. But then all of a sudden, you know, we have the announcement that Rick Becker is going to challenge John Hoeven for the Republican endorsement, and certainly opened some eyes. I'm still not of the opinion that is going to be a super challenging race. But I agree that we're going to have to keep our eye on the convention here, because I think it's very possible that could get weird. And as you've said, you know, perhaps John Hoeven skips the convention. Wouldn't that be interesting? And what does that mean for sort of the party faithful? What does it mean for the party? I think that has lots of interesting questions around it. But yeah, it certainly made things a lot more interesting, Rob. And you know, I think in our world made it a little bit exciting, at least, to see what could happen there. But again, I'm sort of the opinion that maybe this is maybe a little overhyped, but time will tell. I have no idea how much statewide support Rick Becker has. So
yeah, well, see, the interesting thing is there's such a difference between, and for people who don't follow this, and if you're listening to this podcast, I'm assuming that you follow this stuff probably pretty as closely as Matt and I do. But for those of you who maybe don't understand this, the state parties have endorsing conventions. They have local ones first for like legislative candidates, and then they have the statewide endorsing convention for statewide candidates, which would be people like attorney general, governor, and obviously the congressional delegation. So, but the endorsing convention is not the final word, right? So what happens is that the local conventions, they pick delegates from their districts, they go to the state convention, and then those delegates vote on who's going to get the endorsement of the party. But the actual nomination comes on the June ballot, and anybody who walks into a polling place in June and says, I'm a Republican, give me the Republican ballot, can vote on the Republican slate of candidates and the Democratic slate of candidates and the Libertarian slate of candidates, as the case may be. So that's kind of the world that we're living in, where I think Rick Becker and the guy who's running is a guy named Jared Hendricks, who came to North Dakota as part of the Ron Paul campaign in 2012. They are very, very good at getting delegates to local conventions. And it's a lot easier to pack a room and manipulate the delegate selection process in that room than it is to win on a statewide ballot, where more sort of retail politics comes into play. I think when you're talking about, are we overhyping this a little bit? I think the one thing we have to remember is I think if I had to lay a bet, Becker's going to get creamed in June. I just don't see where he's going to get the sort of statewide appeal, especially when a lot of it, he's sending out campaign things about the stolen election. He's pandering to a lot of stuff that I don't know how much of an appetite there is in the general North Dakota electorate for that sort of thing. But at the convention, he get enough delegates? He could get enough delegates.
Yeah, and Rob, I thought your piece, I don't know if it was a week or two ago, that sort of asked the question of whether Hoeven would skip the convention. That had not even crossed my mind. I just assumed that everybody, all the party faithful, would be there. But you made a lot of good points, and the more I thought about it, I'm like, boy, if you're John Hoeven, you don't want a lot of noise around this. You just don't. If he skips the convention, sure, it's a headline, it's a big story, but as you said, you sort of avoid any ugliness that could happen, where he's speaking and people are shouting him down, or there's a crazy exchange between the two or whatever. I think it's entirely possible that he would, find a reason not to be there. And so we're gonna have to keep our eye on that space, because I think that's really interesting. And I think for many people in the state, the last several cycles of these conventions has illustrated that you don't necessarily need the endorsement to win. I think Kevin Kramer, and I think there's been some others too, I can't think of them off the top of my head, that have
Burgum.
That have, right, Burgum, yeah, that found, that really wasn't the way to go, and wasn't needed to win. And it make you wonder sort of, what is the state of these conventions, and if they're not going to have a huge impact on the primary, do they kind of lose their influence?
Well, I mean, that's a debate that's been going on since 12. When Kramer skipped, he was running for Congress. Brian Kalk was the endorsed candidate at the convention, and Kramer beat him pretty decisively on the June ballot. Burgum, the same thing. Burgum finished third at the convention behind Wayne Stenjum and behind Rick Becker. Becker didn't go to the June ballot. Stenjum did, obviously, as the endorsed candidate, and got creamed by Burgum. So I think, and I think for Republicans, because the big debate in the party is they're saying, well, the district conventions are important, and if they're not competitive, people aren't going to show up. And if people don't show up, then how do we connect with the sort of local activists that, do all those things that are really kind of part of the American tradition. The yard signs, organizing parades, organizing, phone banks and door knocking and all that other stuff. If you lose connection with those people, then, the party's going to be weakened. I think that's the argument a lot of Republicans make. But the flip side to that, and I think what people like Hoeven and the argument I've been making is, if you have a convention process that's not going to produce candidates that are palatable to the larger electorate, there's a problem. And I mean, because ultimately in politics, it's say, winning election's not the point. Well, okay, but it's step one. You don't get to govern if you don't win the election. So I always get in trouble. Ed Schaefer tells me he was just on last show, and he jumped on me because I said that the legislature governs, and he says, no, they don't, Port. The governor governs. The legislature legislates. And all right, Ed, I'm sorry for being too expansive in my use of that vocabulary word. But I think your point about, is the convention process producing the sort of outcomes that are beneficial for the Republican Party? I don't know. Burgum kind of proves, obviously, the electorate wanted somebody other than who was endorsed at the convention.
Yeah, and I think also, we've seen this on the national stage. We've seen this in many races. I think it also begs the question of, does party affiliation, that endorsement, is that a blessing or a curse sometimes? I think more and more, and people have said this forever, of course, this, that they don't want, they're not electing a party, they're electing a person, they're electing a platform, and I think sometimes, especially in today's world, that outsider moniker that some people ride. We saw Burgum do that to some success. I think Kramer
whether it's true or not, right?
Exactly.
Some of these guys are. I'm an outsider. Kramer used to be the chairman of the party. What are you talking about?
Yes. No. That's what's funny about it. But it is true that I think sometimes, especially in a state like North Dakota that has sort of, I would argue sort of an independent streak. It has that feel to it sometimes where people are like, well, I'm not really electing the party per se. I'm looking for someone that, matches my ideals and believes what I believe. And for most in North Dakota, that is a Republican candidate. But I think it does beg the question of sometimes, again, are these conventions helpful or potentially even harmful to a candidate in today's political climate?
It's almost like they're almost supposed to be like a focus group, right? But the thing is, focus groups are effective when they're representative of the larger marketplace or whatever it is that you're testing. And I don't think the way that they're operating right now, and the parties, the NDGOP state committee earlier this year had a big debate about whether or not they were even going to hold an endorsing convention this year. They were talking about just delaying the convention until after the June primary, and it would essentially be just a recognition of who won. And the problem with that is, first of all, who's going to sign up to come to that if everybody's just going to get together and have a party? Some people would come, but you're not going to drive the sort of turnout you would normally get. And ultimately, the party decided not to do it. But not before a bunch of I would say district chairs who were very much in that Becker camp walked out, made headlines. So this has been a very, very interesting debate. But meanwhile, I'm kind of looking over at the Democrats thinking, you guys have a real opportunity here. What are you doing with it? I don't see a lot of action over there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's just, for years and years, I've been trying to figure out if it's just a pure numbers game. There's just not enough Democrats in the state to, build anything real. But at the same time, I also wonder sometimes if it's just sort of a lack of energy. And I think we've been asking this question forever: is how do you make those candidates in that party really viable in North Dakota, which is continued to get more conservative over time, not less. Now, I happen to be in in an area of the state that is probably more, 50-50, to be honest.
I always laugh. In any other state, Fargo's a Republican town, but in North Dakota, it's this bastion of liberalism.
A liberal
right?
hotbed, yes.
Right.
So we have, we have some Democratic districts here, and certainly when you look at the election results, it's probably more purpley than anything.
Sure.
You're right. On a national scale, we are, even Fargo, places like that.
A lot of the Democrats are moderate Republicans in other states.
Yes,
right?
yes, yes. So yeah, I mean, when you're living here, you kind of get a sense that, there's actually a pretty good mix of the two parties and the candidates, and it feels certainly like it's more of a toss-up area. But even in West Fargo, which is just on the fringe of Fargo, you look at their voting record, and you're in the West already. I mean, you're in the West the minute you pass 45th Street in Fargo. And
everybody in the political circles, everybody jokes of like the east and west of I-29, right? Which I-29 is almost right on the border, so it's
that's a really good demarcation point too. So we could call it that, but certainly like West Fargo is pretty consistently red, and has gotten more conservative as well over time. So I don't know what the future holds for the party. You did a piece. I thought it was interesting. Are they even trying? I think it's been very difficult for them to find candidates. It's been clear that that's been an issue. And
Chad gets mad at me when I write stuff like that, because it's like, we are trying. We're trying to find people.
Right. No, I mean, and they are, and there is some, especially among some young people. I've noticed even in the press releases we've been getting from the Democratic Party, there's some new names and new faces attached to it. So there are some young people that are, I think, engaged and trying to help and doing some of the legwork that's needed to build the party up. But it is just that would certainly make politics in the state a little bit more interesting, in my opinion. It's just, there's just very few races that you can say are really that there's a possibility the Democrat's going to win, and that's just the truth. I mean, when you look at it, and it's been going more and more the other way, not the right direction for that party. So we continue to keep our eye on it. I know there's been some challenges sort of within the party about its direction and whatnot, and that, at least that shows a little bit of energy. And I do think that I think we saw most of that when Bernie Sanders was running, and there was kind of a Bernie faction of the party that was really pushing hard to kind of push more of the populist issues that maybe would resonate in North Dakota. And
weirdly, there's a lot of overlap between kind of the Bernie Sanders oeuvre and the Trumpism. Really, I mean, it's weirdly. It's kind of a unique phenomena, which is probably the outsider thing, right? Trump's an outsider, Sanders is an outsider. I mean, technically, he's not even a Democrat. He's an independent who caucuses with the Democrats. So,
and that's where I think North Dakota really is. I mean, if you really look at and that's why taking this back kind of full circle to the U.S. Senate race between Hoeven and Becker. That's why I just look at that and I say, okay, many people would say that, certainly Trump had a lot of support in the state. There's no doubt about that. But really, what is that? Where was that support from? And I think there could be an argument made that it's really more of a sort of an anti-Washington, anti-establishment. Not even so much, I would argue, maybe it's like a huge support for Trump as a person, but just kind of what he stood for with a more of an independent streak, more of a backing of traditional values, some of those kind of things that maybe some people saw themselves aligning with.
And for a lot of Republicans, the alternative's Hillary Clinton, right? I mean, it ends up being kind of as a practical matter, it ends up being a binary choice. So people who I cannot vote for Hillary Clinton, I guess I'm going to vote for Donald Trump. I mean, that happens a lot. But speaking of which, I mean, we're living, and this is a big reason why I wanted to have you on, is to talk about how news coverage in this era, because a lot of when you're looking at a lot of these political phenomena we're sort of watching within the North Dakota Republican Party and in some, maybe to a lesser degree, the Democratic-NPL, is a lot of what's driving that is people just sort of creating their own reality. And something that has risen up alongside this, as you look at, they've created their own news sites. They have the Dakotan. I don't know how familiar you are with it up here in Minot, that's owned by one of the district chairs that walked out and is very much a Becker supporter. I mean, they've created kind of their own thing. They have, I mean, it's in some ways, I mean, I can't complain about it because it's how I got my career, was I just started my own thing. But I liked, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I look at what I did as maybe distinct, and maybe that's self-serving on my part, but I think it's really hard because sometimes our jobs is I gotta tell people things they don't want to hear. And the reaction a lot of people have to that these days is, when I'm hearing something I don't like, I'm going to dismiss it and retreat to something that is more in line with what I want to believe, whether it's true or not. How do we deal with that? Because it kind of feels like we're trying to get a bunch of toddlers to eat their broccoli. Maybe that's unkind, but
well, I don't look at it that way necessarily. I think you know, in conversations that I have with readers, they're looking for information. They're looking for information that will help them make good choices, help them understand situations better. Certainly we run into people who don't like sometimes what's reported. We probably get most of the feedback we get, especially in the world of politics, is really about opinion writing.
Sorry.
A lot of times people sort of confuse the opinion making function of the news agency with the news gathering, which is understandable, especially in a social media environment, you know, because if you're looking, say, at a newspaper and you can really tell kind of where the real estate is dedicated to news and opinion, it's much simpler for people. And I think traditional readers really understand the two functions and the two roles. But over time, what's happened really, in my opinion, is that, you know, especially through social media feeds and things like that, it's harder and harder for people to discern between opinion and news. Sometimes that's in the packaging, sometimes that's in the headlines or the presentation of items. All those things are things we have to be aware of. But, you know, I'd say 90% of the feedback we get, especially when it comes to politics, is really about the opinion pieces that we publish. And people have really strong opinions about those. You know, some of those things really chafe people, even cartoons and things like that. You know, they're very sensitive to some of that opinion making. So I always have to remind people when they call about that or reach out about that, is that, you know, in some ways it's a very small piece of what we do and what we bring people. It does garner the most feedback. But that, you know, when it comes to the news, we're really trying to help people understand what's going on, help them know what people are talking about, how decisions are being made. And I do think that for most people, the news has high value to them. And that's why I say, you know, yes, there are platforms certainly that have more of a dedicated focus on those areas than we do even. It's kind of like akin to the world of sports. I always say there's nothing in the sports world that we can cover enough for some people, because they're so highly interested in a certain topic or a certain sport or whatever. It's very hard for a general interest media organization to sort of satisfy their thirst for that information. And so there's always going to be avenues for that. And that's, you know, as you were saying, Rob, that was sort of kind of how, you know, you became very popular, actually. And that's not a bad thing. I think that's great. If people are super interested in something and they want to go deeper and they want to understand something more, and we can't fulfill that role, there's going to be those places for them. What we're trying to do is satisfy and provide information to the most people we can. And I think a lot of, for many people, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for just a better understanding of things, what's going on, how do people feel about certain topics that are of interest to them, how do they vote, things like that on important issues. And so we do try to provide that and just be, just try to be as right down the middle as we possibly can.
Do you ever, one thing when I was running the blog in particular is it seemed like sometimes I would find myself reacting to the people who reacted, the commenters in specifically, and then the social media posts. And then even a lot of the people who would read what I wrote would sort of react as though the comments were representative. Do you ever get the idea that sometimes the feedback we get is not, because one day I looked and the commenters represented a tiny portion of even a post that might have gotten like 300, 400 comments is really a tiny portion of the people who actually read that piece. I don't actually usually hear from most of my readers on a daily basis.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And I think, we even hear that from a lot of people. They actually sort of like the dogfight that occurs in the comments and stuff, but they're never one to comment themselves. So there's a whole lot of voyeurs, I would say, that kind of they read the piece, they want to see what people have to say about it, they like the give and take, but you're right, the people who react in that way, or even I would argue who call us and want to talk about things or complain or compliment, whatever it might be, they probably represent, a very, very small piece of the overall readership or audience that's consuming that information. So yeah, we do. It's important to keep that in mind, because sometimes I think, we're sensitive like anybody would be to feedback, any business would be. And sometimes you do have to keep in mind that, yes, that's great feedback. It's helpful for us to think about certain issues when we're doing what we do, but it's also oftentimes a very, very small piece of the overall audience.
It's interesting to me when you talk about like the distinction between news and opinion, which obviously there's an important distinction. It's there for a reason. We draw that line for a reason. The way I approach my job is different. Now I share a lot of the same goals. I'm just taking a different path. I mean, what I'm trying to illuminate things by making an argument or by taking a position. And sometimes I can sort of drop. I don't have to pretend like I'm neutral. And by doing so, I feel like I can get at more information sometimes. I think that's important. I think because the public, I perceive it sometimes to be more sensitive than it has been in the past to contrary points of view, that drives a lot of it. But again, I don't know if that's just me being sort of self-serving in the way I'm perceiving this, but that's what I see is a lot of times people just don't like to hear things that they don't like.
Yeah, and I think, what you're doing, Rob, I think is a very modern approach to media. I think we're seeing more and more of that where, let's be honest. A lot of people think that we have a bias no matter what we do. And so, I've heard you make this argument before too, is that, why pretend like you're neutral? Why try to present it in that way when, maybe the writer has a point of view or is shaping the story in a certain way to highlight certain things or hide other things, whatever. So I think there's certainly an argument to be made for that. I think we do try, for the most part, to be as objective and neutral as we possibly can, and let the opinion makers, play off that, take that information, expand on it, whatever they might want to do. And I think there's a role for both. I think they're both important, actually, in the shaping of how people feel about things, how people learn about things, and so I certainly don't I'm not anti-opinion by any means, or political commentary or analysis or whatever. I think all that's important for people, and people, again, like people that want to better understand an issue or understand nuances or why things are done the way they are. I think all that information is helpful, and hopefully what people are doing is they're sort of checking themselves sometimes and saying, okay, we always say consider the source in our business, and I think that's really important for people to understand that, what they're reading and how they're consuming it. Do I trust this person? Do I believe, do I believe their analysis? Do I think it's, disingenuous? Do I think there's another motive behind it? I think all that's important for readers to consider. So come at everything, in my opinion, you read and consume and watch with a skeptical eye.
Yeah.
That's what I do.
And I think sometimes maybe refrain from imputing nefarious motive, because I think sometimes like when I talk about bias in the news media, I don't think it's product of people twirling their mustache saying I want to be unfair because I have some agenda and so I want to slant it this way. I think two rational, reasonable people who are trying to produce a fair piece of journalism can look at a set of facts and make very different decisions about what should be the headline, what should be the lead photo, what quotes to include and what quotes to cut. And neither of them are wrong, and neither of them are necessarily motivated by anything bad. They're just humans and have different experiences and different priorities. And I think sometimes you just have to look at it that way. It's human beings trying to be fair. And if it's not perfect, well, find me something that is.
Yeah. And the fact of the matter, too, is that, I think a lot of people sort of think that we sit around a table and try to decide how we're going to shape stories, or that there's some agenda behind things.
Apparently, I'm getting my marching orders from the forum all the time. I'm getting my talking points that I'm supposed to use, which I don't think people realize how little communicate. Like, I'm kind of a bureau unto myself over here, right? My paychecks show up. I'm not talking to a lot of. I don't.
Well, and to be honest, I mean, in a lot of ways, you're working like a lot of journalists in that. For the most part, journalists are extremely busy, and there's not a lot of time often to discuss, the shaping of stories and things like that. We expect them to do their job professionally and to approach stories professionally and try to, contact different parties to get different points of view and things like that. But, we're in a fast-paced world and things move really quickly, and we're, again, nobody's sitting around smoking cigars and trying to decide, how to take down somebody or how to. That just doesn't happen.
I love the view is like back when the papers got their names and it was like the Akron Republican or something, right? And it was the Republican boss, like Boss Hogg smoking a cigar. Like, people have a very 19th century view of how the news gets made, right? It's just ain't like that.
And maybe at one time, you're right. Maybe at one time that was the reality of things, but I can assure you now that does not happen. I mean, we're doing everything we can every day to sort of, stay on top of things, and it's a lot. It's a complex world. We're covering a lot of ground, and those conversations really just do not happen today.
Well, Matt, I appreciate you coming on. It's always a fun discussion, and so much going on in the world, which is good, right? What's the proverb about? May you live in interesting times.
Yes.
Some of I wish things weren't so interesting in Europe right now. Things could be a lot more boring for my taste over there. But anyway, it's interesting. It's always a discussion, always a debate. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Rob.
Want more political news like this? Visit inforum.news/port to get 3 months of unlimited access to our news network for only 99 cents a month. Don't wait. Get this limited time offer at inforum.news/port now.